After the break, people in a vegetative state are usually assumed to be unconscious and unaware of their surroundings. But new research on a patient shows that she can understand what's being said and respond through her brain activity. She can even play tennis in her head. Welcome back. Now, what's going on inside her head? For years, scientists have been debating just what happens to people who are in a vegetative state. Now, a British team has discovered that one patient's brain activity is no different from a healthy person's. Their report in the journal Science reveals how a 23-year-old brain-injured woman can understand instructions and respond through her thoughts, even though she's unable to move or speak. The development could allow doctors to measure levels of awareness in other patients, as our science correspondent Julian Rush reports.
No one really knows what goes on inside the brain of someone in a vegetative state. They're not in a coma, they wake, they sleep, but they don't seem to be aware, and they don't move or communicate. Now scientists in Cambridge have made an extraordinary breakthrough. Using an MRI scanner, they've looked at the brain activity of a young woman severely brain injured in a traffic accident. She'd been unresponsive and vegetative for 5 months, yet when they spoke to her, her brain responded in the same way as conscious, healthy volunteers. And when they asked her to imagine she was playing tennis or to imagine she was walking through the rooms of her own home, her brain's response was again exactly the same as someone who was completely conscious.
This is the brain of a healthy volunteer who's imagining playing a game of tennis. And this is the brain of our patient when we asked her to do exactly the same thing. And as you can see, the same area is activated in both. Similarly, if we look at what happens in the brain of a healthy volunteer when we ask them to imagine walking around the rooms of their home, and do the same thing in the patient, again, exactly the same areas of the brain are activated.
So from this, can you conclude there is some sort of mental life, some sort of consciousness there?
Well, on the basis of these scans that showed us that she could not only understand the instructions that we gave her, but respond to those instructions when we asked her to in the scanner, we believe this certainly means that she was consciously aware, at least in the way that most of us think about awareness.
All sorts of important and very fundamental questions are raised by this research, not least of which, what exactly is consciousness? And do we perhaps need to change the definition of what we mean by vegetative state? And then what about the legal implications when it comes to deciding whether or not to stop the feeding of a patient in the vegetative state?
The case of Tony Bland, brain injured and vegetative after the Hillsborough football disaster, led to a court battle over whether or not to remove his feeding tubes that went to the House of Lords. Doctors who treat vegetative patients believe real-time MRI scans like these may help them diagnose future patients better.
Having an objective test would be a great advantage because we would be able to detect those patients in whom there's clearly potential for further efforts to try and improve their state. We don't know whether we have that as yet, but this is the first inkling that we have that we might be able to put together a battery of tests that allow us to do this in a more objective fashion.
I think actually what's likely to happen is that this may become part of the diagnosis. Many PVS patients you wouldn't be able to get this kind of evidence from, so a court's not going to require useless MRIs on people who clearly don't have this kind of brain activity, but people who do, I think it may well become important.
And perhaps most intriguing of all, this real-time brain scanning technique means we may one day be able to communicate with vegetative patients.
For example, if you wanted to give one type of answer, such as yes, you would ask the person to imagine playing tennis. And if we saw activation in the supplementary motor area, and you'd have to be very careful about this, and you'd have to make sure it was reliable and occurred on several occasions, then one could conclude that the person was communicating that answer, in this case, yes.
That is for the future. This has just been one patient, but the doctors now believe they are one step closer to understanding consciousness, that fundamental difference between humans and animals.